Sometimes the most dangerous moment in a person's life is the moment someone with power decides they already know who you are. The rain was falling in thin silver lines across a dark Texas highway just after 10:40 p.m., the kind of quiet stretch of road where headlights feel brighter and every passing mile seems heavier than the last. Red and blue patrol lights washed over the pavement as Officer Daniel Harper stepped out of his cruiser, one hand resting near his badge, the other raised toward a black SUV idling on the shoulder about 30 feet ahead. The driver's window lowered slowly and the man inside leaned slightly toward the door, calm, steady, the way someone does when they believe a simple explanation will clear everything up. Harper didn't see calm. He saw suspicion. The storm hummed softly over the asphalt while passing trucks shook the wet road with distant thunder. "Step out of the vehicle," Harper ordered, his voice carrying the weight of authority he had worn for years. The man opened the door and stepped out into the flashing lights, tall, composed, dressed in a dark jacket that looked ordinary under the rain. For a moment, they simply stood there, two silhouettes framed by police lights and highway mist, separated by about 10 feet of wet pavement and 1,000 quiet assumptions. "Reach for your identification," Harper said. The man nodded once and slowly moved his hand toward his pocket. What happened next would be replayed later on screens across rooms filled with people who had never stood on that highway. A sudden movement, a shout, a moment where time seemed to fold in on itself. The storm swallowed the echo of a single shot, and then the night fell strangely still again, broken only by the rhythm of rain tapping against metal and glass. The man collapsed against the side of the SUV, his wallet slipping from his hand onto the wet pavement near Harper's boots. For several seconds the officer didn't move. He stared at the wallet as if it were just another piece of evidence waiting to confirm what he already believed. To him, it was simple. Another roadside encounter. Another report to file before midnight. But when the paramedics arrived, and one of them opened that soaked leather wallet beneath the pulsing patrol lights, the atmosphere changed in a way no one could ignore. The ID card inside carried a seal that didn't belong to the city, or the county, or even the state. United States Army. Rank, Lieutenant. Name, Marcus Bennett. And beneath the rain-soaked plastic was a second credential that made the paramedics' hand pause for half a second longer than normal. Pentagon clearance. The flashing lights suddenly felt different, like the quiet before a storm that was just beginning somewhere far beyond that empty highway. Officer Harper still believed he had handled a routine stop. What he didn't realize yet was that the man lying beside that SUV wasn't just another driver on a dark Texas road. He was someone the Pentagon knew by name. And within the next few hours, that name would begin moving through channels of power far beyond Harper's badge. The rain continued to fall across the empty Texas highway as the ambulance lights painted the wet pavement in slow pulses of red and white. And for the first time since the patrol stop began, Officer Daniel Harper felt something unfamiliar settle into the quiet space around him. Not fear exactly, but a tension he could not explain. The paramedic who had opened the wallet looked up again at the identification card, then at the man lying beside the SUV, then back at the card, as if hoping the name might somehow change the second time he read it. Lieutenant Marcus Bennett, United States Army. Harper shifted his weight and crossed his arms, trying to maintain the calm authority he had carried through countless roadside stops over the years. To him, the night still felt routine, another incident that would become paperwork before sunrise. But the paramedic did not return the wallet right away. Instead, he quietly handed it to his partner, who studied the second credential sealed behind the plastic sleeve. Pentagon clearance. The words were small, almost easy to overlook, but they carried a kind of gravity that changed the air around them. One of the younger officers who had arrived for backup leaned closer and spoke in a low voice. "Is that real?" The paramedic nodded slowly. Nobody spoke for several seconds after that. The rain tapped against the side of the SUV, and somewhere in the distance a semi-truck roared past on the interstate, like a reminder that the rest of the world was still moving forward. Finally, the paramedic stood up and looked directly at Harper. "Officer, this identification needs to be logged carefully." Harper gave a short nod, though inside he felt a flicker of irritation. He had already begun forming the explanation he would include in the report. The driver reached for something. The situation became uncertain. Standard procedure followed. The language of law enforcement had a way of smoothing over complicated moments. But the young officer who had asked the question was now staring at the wallet again, his expression shifting from curiosity to something closer to concern. Pentagon clearance does not just appear in someone's pocket, he said quietly. Harper brushed rain from his sleeve and glanced toward the dark highway stretching for miles in both directions. Everyone has a job, he replied. Tonight he was just a driver during a traffic stop. The words sounded firm when he said them, yet something about the paramedic's silence lingered longer than Harper expected. Within minutes the ambulance doors closed, and the vehicle began moving down the road toward the nearest hospital, nearly 20 miles away. The flashing lights slowly disappeared into the rain, leaving only the patrol cars and the quiet hum of engines on the shoulder. Harper exhaled and turned toward his cruiser, already thinking about the report he would file before the end of his shift. What he did not know was that inside the ambulance, one of the paramedics had already used his phone to contact the number listed on the back of that military identification. The call did not reach a local office. It did not connect to a base nearby. Instead, it traveled through a secure line that routed the message hundreds of miles away to a desk inside a quiet building in Washington, District of Columbia, where a late-night duty officer read the name Marcus Bennett on a screen and suddenly sat up straighter in his chair, because that name was not supposed to appear in a report from a small highway in Texas. Nearly 800 miles away, the rain in Texas meant nothing. But inside a quiet operations office in Washington District of Columbia, the atmosphere shifted the moment the name appeared on the duty officer's screen. The room was dim except for the glow of several monitors and the low hum of secure communication systems that rarely carried anything routine after midnight. The officer reading the message leaned forward slowly, scanning the report again as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less serious. Lieutenant Marcus Bennett. Location, rural Texas highway. Status, transported to hospital following roadside encounter. The officer reached for the phone without hesitation and dialed a number that bypassed several normal chains of communication. When the call connected, he spoke in a calm but unmistakably urgent voice. Sir, we have a situation involving Lieutenant Bennett. On the other end of the line, a man who had spent 3 decades in the United States Army sat quietly behind a large desk inside the Pentagon. Colonel Richard Hale had been reviewing operational notes when the call arrived, but the moment he heard the name Marcus Bennett, he closed the folder in front of him. Bennett was not simply another officer on a long list of personnel. He was part of a small group assigned to sensitive work that rarely appeared in public reports. Colonel Hale stood up slowly and walked toward the window overlooking the dark city skyline. Tell me exactly what happened, he said. The duty officer explained the information that had come from Texas, careful with every word because even the smallest detail now carried weight. A traffic stop, a roadside incident, identification confirmed through military credentials, transported to a hospital roughly 20 miles from the scene. There was a long pause on the line after the explanation ended. Colonel Hale understood something the officers in Texas did not yet realize. Marcus Bennett had not been traveling randomly through that part of the country. He had been on assignment, moving quietly between locations connected to a federal security program that required absolute discretion. Hale turned away from the window and pressed a button on the secure console built into his desk. Within seconds, another line connected to a senior administrator inside the Department of Defense command network. I need verification on Lieutenant Bennett's status immediately, Hale said, and I need it routed through the highest clearance channels. Across the Pentagon, several lights blinked on inside offices that normally would have remained dark until morning. Data systems opened files. Personnel logs were checked. Communication signals began moving across secure lines that rarely activated all at once. Back on the Texas highway, Officer Daniel Harper finished documenting the scene while the rain slowly began to lighten. To him, the night was almost over. The patrol cars would return to the station. The report would be written. The road would look the same by morning as it always had. But hundreds of miles away, a different kind of report was forming, one that carried far greater authority than any local incident file. And as Colonel Hale studied the growing details on his screen, he quietly spoke a sentence that would soon change everything connected to that rainy highway stop. If Lieutenant Bennett was involved, he said slowly, then this situation just moved far beyond local jurisdiction. Inside the Pentagon, the quiet tension that had begun with a single name was now spreading through multiple offices, each one connected by secure networks that rarely moved this quickly unless something important had happened. Colonel Richard Hale stood beside the large operations table as new information appeared across the digital display in front of him. The file attached to Lieutenant Marcus Bennett was not large, but every line inside it carried significance. Bennett had served nearly 9 years in the United States Army and had built a reputation that few officers achieved so early in their careers. His record showed calm decision-making, strategic discipline, and a level of trust from senior leadership that was difficult to earn. But what made his situation even more serious was the assignment listed under restricted clearance. Marcus Bennett was currently attached to a joint defense program involving sensitive national security logistics. It was the kind of work that required movement across different states without drawing attention, which explained why he had been driving alone through Texas late at night. Colonel Hale rested both hands on the edge of the table as he studied the timeline forming on the screen. Highway location confirmed. Civilian law enforcement contact confirmed. Medical transport confirmed. Every piece of information pointed back to the same moment on that rain-covered highway where a routine traffic stop had turned into something far more complicated. Across the room, another officer spoke quietly while reviewing communications from the hospital nearly 20 miles from the roadside scene. Lieutenant Bennett is currently receiving medical evaluation, the officer reported. Doctors are working to stabilize him. Hale nodded once, but his attention remained on the broader implications. Situations involving military personnel and local police were not unheard of, yet they almost always resolved quickly once identification was confirmed. What made this case different was the fact that the incident had already occurred before anyone realized who Bennett was. That meant the chain of response had started too late to prevent the problem. And now the responsibility for resolving it had moved upward through layers of authority that could not ignore the circumstances. Hale turned toward the communications officer standing near the console. "Notify the Department of Defense liaison team in Texas," he said. "They need to coordinate directly with the local department involved in this stop." The officer acknowledged the order and began transmitting instructions through a secure channel. While the message traveled south across several states, Officer Daniel Harper was pulling into the parking lot of his precinct back in Texas, the rain finally fading into a thin mist. The building looked exactly the way it always did during the late shift, quiet lights in a few windows, the American flag moving slowly in the night air. Harper stepped out of his cruiser and walked inside with the steady confidence of someone who believed the evening was nearly finished. He placed the incident notes on the front desk and greeted the dispatcher who had worked countless shifts with him over the years. For Harper, it was simply another report waiting to be typed before he could head home. But what he did not know was that nearly 800 miles away, the Pentagon had already begun treating that rainy roadside encounter as a federal-level situation. And as Colonel Hale looked again at the name Marcus Bennett on the operations screen, he spoke softly to the officers around him, not with anger, but with the clear weight of responsibility. "If one of our officers was placed in danger during an official assignment," he said slowly, "then we will need every fact from that highway in Texas before the sun rises." The night shift inside the small Texas precinct moved with the slow rhythm that officers knew well, the steady hum of fluorescent lights, the faint buzz of a radio on the front desk, and the quiet tapping of keys as reports were typed into the system before sunrise. Officer Daniel Harper sat at his desk with his uniform jacket draped over the back of the chair, the faint smell of rain still clinging to the fabric after the long roadside stop. In front of him, the incident report screen glowed softly, waiting for details that would turn the entire night into a few structured paragraphs. Time of stop, approximately 10:40 in the evening. Location, rural highway nearly 20 miles outside the city limits. Driver identified as Marcus Bennett. Harper paused briefly before typing the name, not because it carried meaning to him yet, but because the spelling needed to match the identification card exactly. Across the room, the dispatcher leaned back in her chair while monitoring the quiet radio channels. "Long night out there?" she asked casually without looking up from the console. Harper shrugged slightly and continued typing. "Just another traffic stop that turned complicated," he replied. The words sounded routine, almost automatic, the kind of phrasing officers used when explaining situations that seemed unpredictable but ultimately manageable. He described the weather conditions, the position of the vehicle on the shoulder, and the moment when the driver reached for identification. The language remained careful and controlled, shaped by years of training that taught officers how to translate tense moments into official documentation. What Harper did not realize was that at nearly the same moment he typed the final lines of that description, two unmarked government vehicles were already moving south through Texas along interstate highways under quiet instructions from Washington. Inside the first vehicle sat a Department of Defense liaison officer reviewing the same name Harper had just entered into his report. Marcus Bennett. The liaison officer had seen enough military files to recognize when a situation carried consequences far beyond local jurisdiction. Bennett's assignment was classified at a level that required immediate oversight whenever his status became uncertain. Back in the precinct, Harper leaned back slightly and read over the report again before submitting it into the department system. To him, the structure of the document felt complete. It explained the sequence of events clearly and followed every procedural guideline he had learned during his career. Once the file uploaded, the system displayed the usual confirmation message and logged the report under the department case number for that night. Harper exhaled slowly, satisfied that the most time-consuming part of the shift was finished. Outside the building, the misty air had replaced the earlier storm, and the streets were nearly empty as midnight passed quietly across the town. Yet hundreds of miles away, the information Harper had just filed was already moving through secure federal networks where it was being examined by people who measured events differently than a small city police department. Colonel Richard Hale stood once again beside the operations table inside the Pentagon as new updates arrived from Texas. The hospital had confirmed that Lieutenant Marcus Bennett was still under intensive medical evaluation and remained under close observation. Hale folded his arms and looked at the officers around him. The situation was no longer developing slowly. It was moving toward a moment when questions would have to be asked directly to the people who had been present on that dark highway. And as the first federal liaison team continued driving toward the town where Harper worked, one fact was becoming clear to everyone watching the situation unfold. By morning, the quiet report filed inside that small precinct would no longer belong only to local records. Long before sunrise, the quiet town in Texas was still wrapped in the pale gray calm that comes just before morning, the kind of silence where the streets feel wider and every streetlight casts a lonely circle on the pavement. Inside the precinct, officer Daniel Harper finally stood from his desk after submitting the report that had taken most of the night to finish. The shift had stretched longer than expected, but in his mind the situation was now documented and closed from his perspective. The rain had faded completely, and the air outside the station carried the cool scent that often followed a late spring storm. Harper poured a cup of coffee from the old machine in the break room and leaned against the counter while checking the time on the wall clock. It was a little after 1:15 in the morning. Only a few hours remained before the day's shift would begin arriving. Across town, the hospital emergency entrance glowed brightly against the dark parking lot as medical staff moved quietly through their routines. Lieutenant Marcus Bennett was now inside a monitored room where doctors continued their careful evaluation, the steady rhythm of machines marking each passing minute. None of the staff members knew the full details of why the Pentagon had already begun contacting the hospital administration, but the request from Washington had been clear. Lieutenant Bennett's condition and status were now part of a federal-level situation. Nearly 200 miles north of the hospital, a pair of dark government vehicles continued moving through the night along a nearly empty interstate highway. The drivers had not used sirens or flashing lights because this was not the kind of response that attracted attention. Inside the lead vehicle, the Department of Defense liaison officer studied the latest update sent from Washington. The report filed by Officer Harper had already reached federal review systems and was being examined line by line by people trained to notice small details others might overlook. Every sentence describing the roadside encounter was now part of a much larger timeline that investigators would soon reconstruct. The liaison officer lowered the tablet and looked out through the windshield as the headlights cut through the open Texas road ahead. "We will be there before sunrise," he said quietly to the driver. Back at the precinct, Harper stepped outside for a moment, the coffee warming his hands while he looked across the empty parking lot. Nights like this had always felt routine during his career. A few calls, a few reports, then the quiet satisfaction of knowing the shift was finished. What he could not see from where he stood was the long stretch of highway several miles away where two unmarked vehicles were steadily approaching the town limits. Nor could he see the growing number of federal messages moving through secure networks between Washington and Texas. Inside the Pentagon, Colonel Richard Hale remained awake beside the operations table as the latest information appeared on the screen. The location of the liaison team had been confirmed. The hospital update had been received. The incident report from the local department had been archived for review. Hale rested his hands behind his back and spoke calmly to the officers around him. "When our team arrives," he said slowly, "we will learn exactly what happened on that highway." Outside the Pentagon, the city lights of Washington continued glowing through the early morning darkness. But far away in Texas, the road leading toward Harper's precinct was now only a few miles long, and the quiet night that had seemed so ordinary hours earlier was about to change in a way the local department had not yet imagined. The first light of morning had not yet reached the horizon when the two dark government vehicles finally exited the interstate and turned onto the quiet highway leading into town. The road signs reflected briefly in the headlights before disappearing again into the early morning darkness. And the driver slowed slightly as the navigation display confirmed the final miles of their route. Inside the lead vehicle, the Department of Defense liaison officer studied the latest message from Washington one more time. The instructions were simple but firm. Establish contact with the local department. Secure all information related to the roadside encounter. Verify the sequence of events involving Lieutenant Marcus Bennett. The officer closed the tablet and looked ahead as the small town began to appear in the distance, its scattered streetlights glowing softly against the fading night sky. At nearly the same moment, Officer Daniel Harper finished his coffee outside the precinct and stepped back inside the building, unaware that the quiet shift he believed was ending was about to draw unexpected attention. The front desk area remained calm, with only the dispatcher and one other officer reviewing paperwork from earlier calls. Harper placed the empty cup in the trash and began gathering his belongings, already imagining the short drive home and the few hours of sleep that usually followed a late shift. The clock on the wall now read 1:38 in the morning. Across town, the hospital remained busy as doctors continued monitoring Lieutenant Bennett's condition, while administrative staff quietly responded to additional inquiries coming through secure federal channels. The requests were polite but unmistakably official, asking for confirmation of medical status and identification records. No one inside the hospital fully understood why the Department of Defense had become involved so quickly, but the seriousness of the communication left little doubt that the patient in their care was connected to something important. Meanwhile, the government vehicles rolled slowly through the nearly empty streets until the familiar shape of the local police station came into view ahead. The building looked exactly like hundreds of other small precincts across the country, practical, modest, and quiet during the overnight hours. The driver guided the vehicle into the parking lot and turned off the engine, leaving the headlights shining briefly across the front entrance before the darkness settled again. The liaison officer stepped out and adjusted his jacket while the second vehicle parked behind them. For a moment, the early morning air felt completely still, the kind of calm that comes just before a conversation that will change the direction of events. Inside the precinct, the dispatcher glanced up from her console when the headlights outside flashed. Across the front windows, she leaned slightly toward the glass and noticed the unfamiliar vehicles parked near the entrance. "Looks like we have visitors," she said casually to the room. Harper paused while lifting his jacket and glanced toward the door, not yet recognizing the significance of the arrival. A few seconds later, the entrance opened and two men stepped inside, carrying identification that reflected the overhead lights in small polished flashes. One of them spoke with calm authority as he approached the desk. "Good morning," he said evenly. "We are here on behalf of the Department of Defense regarding the incident involving Lieutenant Marcus Bennett." The quiet station suddenly felt different, and for the first time since the rainy stop on the highway, Officer Daniel Harper realized the night was not finished at all. The quiet inside the precinct shifted the moment the two men stepped through the entrance, their presence carrying the calm confidence of people who did not need to raise their voices to be taken seriously. The overhead lights reflected softly against the small identification badges they placed on the counter, each one bearing the seal of the Department of Defense. The dispatcher leaned forward slightly to examine the credentials, while the other officer at the desk straightened in his chair with the instinctive awareness that this was no ordinary visit. The liaison officer spoke again in a measured tone that filled the room without sounding aggressive. "We are here regarding the roadside incident involving Lieutenant Marcus Bennett." The name seemed to hang in the air for a moment, as if everyone present understood that it carried weight far beyond a simple traffic stop. Officer Daniel Harper stood a few feet away holding his jacket, the quiet confidence from earlier slowly fading as he listened. He had expected paperwork and routine follow-up questions from his own department, not federal representatives arriving before sunrise. The second liaison officer placed a thin folder on the counter and opened it carefully. Inside were printed copies of the incident report Harper had submitted less than an hour earlier. The speed at which the document had moved from a local computer system to a federal desk was something Harper had never experienced before. The liaison officer glanced down at the report and then back up at the room. "We will need access to all documentation connected to the encounter," he said. "Body camera recordings, radio communication logs, and any additional reports filed during the shift." The request was delivered calmly, but the authority behind it was unmistakable. The dispatcher nodded and began opening the department database, while the other officer moved toward the evidence console where body camera data was stored. Harper remained still for a moment, processing the realization that the events from the rainy highway were no longer just a local matter. The liaison officer finally turned his attention directly toward him. "Officer Harper," he said evenly after reading the name from the report. Harper stepped forward slowly. "Yes, sir." The officer did not raise his voice or accuse him of anything, yet his words carried a seriousness that made the room feel smaller. "We would like you to walk us through the sequence of events exactly as they occurred on the highway tonight." Harper nodded once, his mind replaying the flashing lights, the rain, and the moment the driver reached toward his pocket. Across the room, the dispatcher quietly transferred the requested files into a secure system, while the second liaison officer reviewed timestamps and patrol logs. Outside the precinct, the early morning sky was beginning to lighten with the faintest shade of gray along the horizon. In Washington, the operations center inside the Pentagon remained active as Colonel Richard Hale watched the incoming updates from Texas. The liaison team had arrived. The documentation was being secured. The investigation into what happened on that lonely highway was now officially underway. Back inside the small station, Harper began explaining the stop step by step, believing that the details in his report would answer every question. But as the liaison officer listened carefully, occasionally glancing down at the body camera timeline now appearing on the screen, it became clear that the next few minutes would reveal far more about that rainy encounter than anyone in the room had expected. The quiet inside the station grew heavier as the body camera recording finally appeared on the monitor, its small digital clock marking the exact moment the roadside stop had begun hours earlier on the rain-covered highway. Officer Daniel Harper stood beside the desk while the liaison officers watched the screen with careful attention, neither of them interrupting as the footage showed flashing patrol lights reflecting across wet pavement and the silhouette of a dark SUV parked along the shoulder. The sound of rain tapping against the microphone filled the room as the video moved forward second by second. Harper explained what he remembered, describing the vehicle, the weather, and the moment the driver stepped out after being asked for identification. His voice remained steady, shaped by the belief that his written report already captured the situation accurately. Yet as the recording continued, the small details became impossible to ignore. The man beside the SUV moved calmly. His posture showed no urgency, only the careful patience of someone responding to an officer's instructions on a dark highway. When the moment came where the driver reached toward his pocket for identification, the liaison officer quietly raised a hand. "Pause the video right there," he said. The dispatcher froze the frame. On the screen, Lieutenant Marcus Bennett stood under the flashing lights, rain falling across his jacket while his hand moved slowly toward his wallet. The image remained still for several seconds as the liaison officer studied it without speaking. Around the room, no one moved. The only sound was the soft hum of the computer and the faint buzz of the station lights overhead. Finally, the officer turned toward Harper. His tone remained calm, but his words carried a deeper weight than before. "Officer Harper, Lieutenant Bennett was operating under a Department of Defense assignment that required him to travel through several states without drawing attention. Harper blinked once, the information settling in slowly. The liaison officer continued speaking with quiet precision. He was not a suspect in any investigation. He was a United States Army officer moving between federal locations as part of a classified support operation. Across the room, the second liaison officer closed the folder containing the printed report and placed both hands on the desk. This means that every moment of this encounter will now be reviewed through a federal investigation process, he said evenly. Harper felt the realization begin to shift the ground beneath everything he had assumed about the night. What had seemed like a routine stop on an empty highway was now connected to people and institutions far beyond his department. Outside the station, the early morning light was finally beginning to spread across the horizon, soft gray sunlight touching the quiet streets of the town. Hundreds of miles away inside the Pentagon, Colonel Richard Hale read the first summary from the liaison team and slowly folded his hands behind his back. The timeline was becoming clear. The roadside encounter had unfolded in a matter of minutes, yet the consequences would stretch much further than that lonely stretch of Texas road. Back inside the station, the liaison officer looked at Harper one last time before speaking again. The investigation will determine every detail, he said calmly, because sometimes a single moment on a quiet highway reveals something much larger than anyone expected. And as the screen continued to display the frozen image of Lieutenant Marcus Bennett standing beneath the flashing patrol lights, everyone in the room understood that the story of that rainy night was only beginning to unfold.